Hi, I'm Keon, a senior research analyst with Thomson Reuters Lipper. I'm here to talk to you about the fund flows activity for the week ended Wednesday, January 24th. We'll start this week's report by taking a quick look at the market activity for the week. Both the S&P 500 and the Dow Jones Industrial Average continued on their winning ways. S&P was up 1.25% on the week, and the Dow gained 0.52%. This pushes their respective year-to-date gains to 6.1% and 6.2%. The markets took strength last week, or took some momentum last week from avoiding what could have been a prolonged government shutdown. At least they avoided it temporarily. We'll see what happens in the next few weeks, as well as some stronger than expected corporate earnings. Of note amongst the corporate earnings was Netflix. Their better than expected fourth quarter earnings pushed a one-day stock rise of approximately 10%. We pushed them to a closing record high, as well as pushing past the $100 billion market cap barrier for the first time. Let's turn our attention back now to the fund flows activity for the week. We'll start by taking a look at the fund macro groups. We see that equity mutual funds took in about $137 million for the week. Taxable bond funds had net inflows of roughly $4.9 billion. Muni bond funds, another pretty strong week for them, net inflows of just short of $800 million. And money market funds grew their coffers by $8.2 billion. Let's take a closer look at each one of the groups now. We'll start again with the equity mutual fund group. The $137 million inflow was their fifth straight weekly net inflow, continuing the long-term trend that we've seen for well over a year now. Non-domestic equity funds took in net new money, about $2.2 billion this week, and domestic equity funds saw money leave, about $2.1 billion. Breaking the regional groups down a little more granularly, we see emerging market equity funds with net inflows of $535 million, and large cap core funds saw about just shy of $800 million leave their coffers. We'll move on to our equity ETF group. Net inflows for this group as well last week, but a little more extreme. They took in $23.3 billion, their fifth largest weekly net inflow ever for the group. The inflows were paced by the SPDR S&P 500 product, had net inflows just shy of $14 billion, followed next by the PowerShares QQQ, net inflows of $1.2 billion for them. Conversely, we saw the Financial Select Sector SPDR had net outflows of just over $630 million for the week. We'll move on to our taxable bond fund categories now. We'll start with the mutual fund side of things. This group also had net inflows last week. They took in $4.9 billion of net new money, their fourth straight weekly net inflows. The net inflows were paced by the core bond fund groups. Core bond funds took in $1.5 billion, and core plus bond funds had about $1.2 billion in net inflows. On the sell side of things, we see high yield bond funds had about $510 million leave their coffers. We'll move on to the ETF taxable bonds now. Net inflows here as well last week, although not quite as high. We saw $472 million in net new money go into taxable bonds ETFs last week. The leaders, the largest inflows among individual ETFs were the iShares, JP Morgan, US dollar, emerging market bond product had about $300 million go into their coffers. The SPDR portfolio aggregate bond product had about $259 million in net inflows, while the iShares iBox investment grade corporate product saw about $1.2 billion leave. Moving on now to our muni bond fund group. Net inflows here as well last week. Third straight week of pretty solid inflows for the group. They took in $799 million, which followed on the heels of two straight weeks of net inflows of just over $1 billion. The major contributing groups last week were general muni debt funds as well as intermediate muni debt funds, took in roughly $800 million and $314 million respectively, while for net outflows we see that the short muni debt fund group had about $240 million leave their coffers. Our last group to take a look at this week is money market funds. Pretty strong week for money market funds last week, $8.2 billion in net inflows, paced by institutional U.S. government products, had about $4 billion in net inflows, while institutional money market products took in $2 billion. That wraps up this week's report. If you'd like to take a closer look at the data for yourself, please join us at our website, which is www.lipperusfundflows.com. And please join us here again next week, where another one of our analysts will be speaking about that week's fund flows activity.